The morning fog rolled across the Finnish countryside like a thick blanket, muffling every sound and hiding the world in a gray embrace. Simo Haiha pulled his worn woolen cap down over his ears and stepped out of his small farmhouse, rifle in hand. At just over 5 feet tall and weighing barely 150 pounds, he looked more like a schoolteacher than a soldier. The neighbors in the village of Rotjärvi knew him as the quiet farmer who helped his elderly mother tend their modest plot of land. They had no idea they were looking at someone who would soon become the most feared marksman in military history. The year was 1939, and the world was already feeling the tremors of war. Adolf Hitler had invaded Poland just months before, and now the Soviet Union was eyeing Finland with hungry intentions. Most Finns went about their daily lives hoping the storm would pass them by. But Simo had been preparing for something like this his entire life, though he never knew it at the time. As a boy growing up in the forests of southern Finland, Simo spent countless hours hunting with his father. While other children played games in the village square, he was learning to read the wind, to move silently through dense woods, and to place a shot exactly where he intended. His father taught him that patience was more important than speed, that understanding your environment was more valuable than the finest equipment. These lessons, learned in pursuit of deer and elk, would soon prove invaluable in a very different kind of hunt. The hunting trips weren't just about putting food on the table, though the family certainly needed it. Finland in the 1920s and 1930s was a poor country, still recovering from its recent independence from Russia. Most families lived simple lives, growing what they could and making do with very little. For Simo, the forest became a second home, a place where he felt completely at ease. He learned to read every shadow, to notice when birds suddenly went quiet, to sense movement that others would miss entirely. By his teenage years, Simo had developed skills that amazed even the most experienced hunters in the region. He could hit targets that others couldn't even see, moving silently through terrain that would leave city dwellers lost and confused. His reputation spread slowly through the small farming communities, though Simo himself remained modest about his abilities. He was simply doing what felt natural to him. When Finland regained its independence, the morning of March 6, 1940, brought unseasonably warm weather to the Karelian Isthmus, causing the thick snow to begin its slow transformation into treacherous slush. For Simo Haiha, this change in conditions represented more than just operational difficulties. It marked the beginning of what everyone knew would be the final phase of Finland's desperate struggle for survival against the Soviet invasion. Soviet forces had spent weeks preparing for their ultimate assault, bringing together nearly 1 million soldiers, thousands of artillery pieces, and hundreds of aircraft for a coordinated attack designed to overwhelm Finnish defenses through sheer overwhelming force. Intelligence reports reaching Finnish command indicated that Stalin had grown tired of the prolonged conflict and had ordered his generals to end Finnish resistance within days, regardless of the cost. For Simo, the approaching offensive meant a fundamental change in the nature of his missions. Instead of operating as a lone hunter deep in enemy territory, he would now be defending fixed positions alongside regular infantry units. The tactics that had made him so devastatingly effective as an individual operator would have to be adapted for the chaotic reality of large-scale conventional warfare. The defensive position assigned to Simo's unit was located on the Kala River, a strategic waterway that represented one of the few remaining natural barriers between Soviet forces and Finland's heartland. The terrain was less favorable than the deep forests where Simo had achieved his greatest successes, offering fewer concealment options and requiring him to work within the constraints of predetermined defensive lines. Despite these limitations, Simo approached the new assignment with the same methodical preparation that had characterized all his previous operations. He spent days studying the ground around the river position, identifying every possible shooting lane, calculating distances to potential target areas, and establishing multiple concealed positions that would allow him to move between firing points without exposing himself to enemy observation. The defensive preparations were unlike anything Simo had experienced during his solo missions. Instead of working alone or with 1 or 2 companions, he was now part of a larger unit responsible for holding a specific section of the Finnish line. The presence of other soldiers created both opportunities and challenges, providing additional firepower and observation capabilities while also requiring coordination and communication that could potentially compromise his preferred methods of operation. The Soviet assault began before dawn with an artillery bombardment that exceeded anything witnessed during the entire war. Thousands of guns opened fire simultaneously, turning the Finnish defensive positions into a hellscape of explosions, flying debris, and choking smoke. The bombardment continued for hours, designed to crush Finnish morale and eliminate defensive positions before the infantry assault even began. Simo weathered the bombardment in a reinforced bunker that he had modified with additional camouflage and firing ports. The constant explosions made accurate shooting impossible, but they also provided valuable intelligence about Soviet tactics and troop dispositions. Through brief glimpses between explosions, he could see enemy forces massing for the assault, officers directing artillery observers, and supply columns moving forward to support the coming attack. When the artillery finally lifted and Soviet infantry began their advance across the frozen river, Simo was ready with a reception that stunned even his own commanders. His first shots targeted Soviet officers who were directing the assault, causing immediate confusion as units lost their leadership at the critical moment when coordination was most essential. Without clear direction, the advancing soldiers began to bunch up in vulnerable formations that provided ideal targets for continued precision fire. The advancing Soviet forces had been told that the preliminary bombardment would have eliminated most Finnish resistance, but they discovered instead that they were walking into perfectly prepared killing zones defended by soldiers who had used the bombardment time to finalize their defensive preparations. Simo's rifle fire was complemented by machine guns, mortars, and artillery that turned the river crossing into a catastrophe for the attacking forces. Despite the devastating casualties inflicted during the first assault, Soviet commanders continued to send wave after wave of infantry across the river. The numerical advantage was so overwhelming that Finnish defenders could eliminate hundreds of enemy soldiers without significantly reducing the pressure on their positions. For every Soviet soldier that fell to Simo's rifle, 10 more appeared to take his place. The battle developed into a horrific war of attrition that tested the limits of human endurance on both sides. Simo fired so many rounds that his rifle barrel became too hot to touch, requiring him to switch between multiple weapons to maintain his rate of fire. His ammunition consumption during this single day exceeded what he had used during some entire weeks of solo operations, but the target-rich environment meant that virtually every shot found its mark. As the day progressed, Soviet tactics evolved in response to the devastating effectiveness of Finnish defensive fire. Artillery strikes were called in on specific positions that were causing the most casualties, forcing defenders to constantly shift locations to avoid being eliminated by indirect fire. Counter-sniper teams were deployed with specific orders to identify and neutralize the marksman who was causing such disproportionate damage to the assault forces. Simo adapted to these changing conditions with the same flexibility that had made him so effective during his solo missions. When artillery strikes made his primary firing position untenable, he moved to alternate locations that he had prepared days earlier. When Soviet snipers began targeting his muzzle flash, he used smoke and debris from the bombardment to mask his shots and confuse enemy observers about his actual location. The intensity of the combat was unlike anything Simo had experienced during his solo operations. Instead of the patient, methodical hunting that had characterized his individual missions, he was now engaged in rapid, high-volume shooting against targets that appeared and disappeared in seconds. The skills that had made him so effective as a lone hunter proved equally valuable in this chaotic environment, but the physical and mental demands were exponentially greater. By mid-afternoon, the ground around the river crossing was littered with Soviet casualties, but the assault continued with fresh units being fed into the attack as fast as they could be brought forward. Finnish ammunition supplies were running low, and several key defensive positions had been overrun despite the heroic efforts of their defenders. It became clear that the sheer weight of numbers would eventually overwhelm even the most skillful defensive efforts. The moment that would define the rest of Simo's life came during the late afternoon hours of March 6th. Soviet forces had finally identified his primary firing position through careful observation of muzzle flashes and trajectory analysis. A specialized sniper team equipped with the finest equipment available had been tasked with eliminating the Finnish marksman who had become the symbol of enemy resistance. The Soviet counter-sniper who finally acquired Simo as a target was himself a skilled marksman with dozens of confirmed kills to his credit. He had studied reports of previous encounters with the White Death and understood that he would have only one opportunity to take the shot before his own position was compromised. When Simo briefly exposed himself while engaging a group of Soviet infantry crossing the river, the enemy sniper was ready. The explosive bullet that struck Simo in the jaw was designed to cause maximum damage to human targets. The impact destroyed most of the left side of his face, shattered numerous teeth, and caused massive bleeding that would have been immediately fatal under normal circumstances. The force of the impact knocked him unconscious and left him lying motionless in his firing position, where other Finnish soldiers initially assumed he had been killed. The immediate aftermath of Simo's wounding created chaos in the Finnish defensive positions. Soldiers who had drawn courage from his seemingly invincible presence suddenly realized that their legendary marksman was down, possibly dead. The psychological impact on defending forces was almost as significant as the tactical loss of his exceptional shooting skills. However, the medical personnel who reached Simo discovered that he was still alive, though barely. The same physical toughness that had allowed him to endure months of operations in brutal winter conditions had somehow enabled him to survive an injury that would have killed most men instantly. Emergency treatment stabilized his condition enough for evacuation to a field hospital, though his survival remained extremely doubtful. The evacuation of Simo from the Kala River position marked the end of his active participation in the Winter War, but his legend continued to grow even as he lay unconscious in a hospital bed. Stories of his final day of combat spread throughout the Finnish military, describing how he had continued fighting even after sustaining his devastating wound, firing his last shots while blood streamed from his shattered face. Soviet forces who overran the Finnish position found evidence of the extraordinary marksmanship that had made Simo so feared throughout their ranks. Spent cartridges marked the locations where he had fired hundreds of rounds with deadly accuracy, and the positions of Soviet casualties told the story of a single marksman who had single-handedly disrupted an assault by thousands of soldiers. The Soviet military leadership issued statements claiming that they had finally eliminated the phantom sniper who had terrorized their forces throughout the winter campaign. These premature announcements of Simo's death were designed to boost Red Army morale and convince Finnish defenders that their most effective soldier was no longer a factor in the conflict. In reality, Simo's survival became a closely guarded secret within Finnish medical circles. Military doctors worked around the clock to save the life of a man who had become a national hero, using every available technique to repair the catastrophic damage to his face and jaw. The extent of his injuries meant that even survival would require months of recovery and multiple reconstructive surgeries. The Winter War officially ended just 5 days after Simo was wounded, when Finland signed a peace treaty that ceded significant territory to the Soviet Union but preserved the nation's independence. The timing seemed almost symbolic, as if the conflict could not continue once its most legendary figure had fallen. In reality, Finland's decision to negotiate was based on the recognition that continued resistance was impossible against such overwhelming odds. As news of the peace treaty reached hospitals throughout Finland, medical staff treating Simo realized they were caring for a living symbol of their nation's incredible resistance against impossible odds. This quiet farmer who had never sought fame or recognition had become the embodiment of Finnish determination to survive as a free people, regardless of the cost. The recovery process would prove to be almost as challenging as Simo's wartime service. Multiple surgeries were required to reconstruct his shattered jaw and repair the extensive damage to his face. He would never again possess the perfect physical condition that had made him such an effective marksman, but he had already achieved something far more important than personal combat effectiveness. Simo Häyhä had demonstrated that exceptional individuals could have strategic impact even in conflicts between nations. His 542 confirmed kills during the 100-day Winter War represented the highest sniper total in military history, but his psychological impact on enemy forces was probably even more significant than his tactical achievements. When Simo finally regained consciousness weeks after the war's end, he discovered that the world had changed around him. He was no longer an anonymous farmer from a small Finnish village, but an international symbol of resistance against overwhelming odds. His story had been reported in newspapers around the globe, inspiring people everywhere who faced seemingly impossible challenges. The legend of the White Death would outlive the war that created it, inspiring countless military personnel and civilians who learned that exceptional skill, combined with determination and intimate knowledge of one's environment, could overcome advantages in numbers and equipment. For Simo himself, the greatest victory was simply returning home to the forests he loved, forever changed but still essentially the quiet, modest man who had answered his country's call when it mattered most. The temperature had dropped to -40°C, cold enough to freeze exposed skin in minutes, and turn metal rifle parts so brittle they could crack under stress. Most soldiers on both sides of the conflict had retreated to heated bunkers and fortified positions, waiting for the brutal Arctic winter to ease its grip. But Simo Häyhä was not like most soldiers. While others huddled around fires and complained about the impossible conditions, he saw opportunity in the frozen wasteland that Finland had become. Snow lay 3 feet deep across the landscape, broken only by the dark spines of pine trees that thrust up through the white blanket like skeleton fingers. The shortened winter days meant that useful light lasted only a few hours, but those hours belonged entirely to Simo. He had adapted his hunting techniques for this new environment, learning to use the snow and cold as allies rather than obstacles. The Soviet forces facing him had not adapted nearly as well. Most of the Red Army soldiers came from warmer regions of the Soviet Union and had never experienced cold like this. They wore uniforms designed for temperate climates, carried equipment that failed in extreme temperatures, and moved through the forest like tourists visiting an alien planet. Their dark winter coats stood out against the white snow like targets painted for easy shooting. Simo, by contrast, had spent his entire life in these forests during every season. He knew which snow would support a man's weight and which would give way beneath his feet. He understood how the cold affected the trajectory of bullets, how wind patterns changed in freezing temperatures, and how to dress for extended periods of motionless waiting without losing feeling in his extremities. His standard equipment was almost laughably simple compared to what most snipers carried. While Soviet marksmen used rifles with complex telescopic sights that could fog up in extreme cold, Simo preferred the iron sights on his Finnish-made Mosin-Nagant rifle. The metal sights never fogged, never reflected sunlight to give away his position, and never required adjustment for changing temperatures. His white winter camouflage was sewn together from bed sheets and flour sacks, creating a ghostly silhouette that disappeared completely against the snow-covered landscape. The tactics Simo developed during this period would be studied by military strategists for decades afterward. He would arrive at his chosen position hours before dawn, moving through the forest so quietly that he left barely any trail in the snow. Once in position, he would remain motionless for the entire day if necessary, waiting for the perfect shot opportunity while enemy patrols passed within meters of his hiding place without ever suspecting his presence. His shooting positions were masterpieces of camouflage and fieldcraft. Simo would build shallow depressions in the snow, lined with pine branches for insulation and carefully shaped to provide stable shooting rests while keeping his silhouette below the surrounding terrain. He learned to pile snow in front of his muzzle to prevent the telltale puff of vapor that marked a rifle shot in cold weather, and to position himself so that enemy forces would be looking directly into the low winter sun when trying to spot his muzzle flash. The psychological impact of Simo's operations grew exponentially during this period. Soviet patrols began reporting encounters with a supernatural enemy who could strike from any direction and then vanish without leaving a trace. Soldiers claimed that their comrades were being picked off by a ghost who could shoot through solid trees, who could be in multiple places at once, and who could kill from distances that exceeded the range of normal weapons. These reports, while obviously exaggerated by fear and confusion, contained enough truth to cause serious concern among Soviet commanders. Intelligence analysts studying the pattern of attacks realized they were dealing with a single individual whose kill rate exceeded anything in their experience. Conservative estimates suggested that this lone marksman was eliminating more enemy personnel per day than entire infantry companies managed during major assaults. The Soviet military response was swift and overwhelming. Entire artillery batteries were directed to shell areas where the phantom sniper had been spotted, turning square kilometers of forest into cratered wastelands. Counter-sniper teams equipped with the most advanced equipment available were deployed with specific orders to hunt down and eliminate the individual they had begun calling the White Death. Simo adapted to these escalating countermeasures with the same patience and intelligence he brought to everything else. When artillery bombardments turned his favorite shooting positions into smoking ruins, he simply moved to new locations and began the process of establishing concealed positions all over again. When counter-sniper teams arrived to hunt him, he hunted them instead, using their own aggressive tactics against them. The most dramatic encounter occurred on a gray morning in January when a specially trained Soviet sniper team took up positions overlooking a forest road that Simo was known to use. The team consisted of 3 highly skilled marksmen, each equipped with the finest telescopic sights and winter gear that Soviet industry could produce. They had studied reports of previous encounters and believed they understood how the White Death operated. What they didn't understand was that Simo had been watching them establish their position from a hiding place less than 50 meters away. He had arrived at the area hours before dawn and had observed the entire enemy team as they moved into what they thought was a perfect ambush position. From his concealed location, Simo could see the steam from their breathing, the occasional movement as they shifted position, and the glint of sunlight reflecting off their telescopic sights. The 3 Soviet snipers waited through the morning, confident that their quarry would eventually present himself for the perfect shot. What they got instead was a demonstration of skills that exceeded their worst nightmares. Simo's first shot struck the team leader in the head from an angle that should have been impossible given the known terrain features. Before the other 2 could react, he had shifted position and fired again, eliminating the second sniper with a shot that seemed to come from a completely different direction. The surviving member of the counter-sniper team spent the next hour in a state of panic, firing wildly at shadows and imagined movement, while Simo patiently waited for the perfect opportunity to end the encounter. When the Soviet soldier finally broke cover and tried to retreat to safety, Simo's third shot dropped him in the open ground between tree lines, where his body would be found days later by patrols sent to investigate the team's disappearance. Reports of this engagement reached the highest levels of Soviet command and resulted in an unprecedented response. Stalin himself authorized the deployment of entire regiments with the specific mission of hunting down the individual sniper who was causing such disproportionate damage to Red Army morale and operations. Artillery strikes were increased to round-the-clock bombardments of suspected sniper positions, turning vast areas of Finnish forest into moonscapes of shattered trees and frozen mud. The bounty placed on Simo's head grew to levels typically reserved for enemy generals or political leaders. Soviet propaganda began describing the White Death as a supernatural enemy who represented everything evil about Finnish resistance to the glorious liberation being offered by the Red Army. Soldiers were told that capturing or killing this phantom would result in immediate promotion and rewards that would set them up for life. None of these measures had any meaningful impact on Simo's operations. If anything, the increased attention made his missions easier by drawing large numbers of enemy forces into predictable search patterns that he could exploit. Soviet units assigned to hunt him down found themselves being systematically eliminated by the very individual they were supposed to capture. Entire companies would enter sections of forest and simply disappear, leaving behind only abandoned equipment and increasingly desperate radio transmissions describing encounters with an invisible enemy. The winter of 1939 to 1940 became known as the Winter of the White Death, among Soviet forces in the Finnish theater. Morale plummeted as soldiers realized that their numerical and technological advantages meant nothing against an enemy who could strike from any direction and disappear without a trace. Desertion rates increased dramatically as soldiers decided that prison camps were preferable to facing the phantom sniper in the frozen forests. Simo's confirmed kill count during this period reached levels that military historians still find difficult to believe. Conservative estimates suggest that he eliminated over 500 enemy soldiers during the 100-day conflict, an average of 5 kills per day in conditions that most marksmen would consider impossible for accurate shooting. His unconfirmed kills, based on Soviet reports of missing personnel in areas where he operated, likely exceeded 800 individuals. These numbers represented more than just tactical victories. Each successful mission disrupted Soviet operations far beyond the immediate casualties inflicted. Supply convoys required increasingly heavy escorts, reducing the efficiency of logistics operations. Reconnaissance patrols had to move in larger groups, making them slower and more visible to other Finnish defenders. Officers became reluctant to expose themselves for command purposes, degrading the effectiveness of Soviet unit coordination. The psychological impact extended beyond the immediate combat zone. Reports of the White Death spread throughout the Red Army, creating a legend that made every shadow suspicious and every forest potentially deadly. Soviet soldiers in other theaters began reporting phantom sniper attacks, even in areas where Finnish forces were not present. The mere possibility of facing an opponent like Simo Häyhä became a source of terror that affected Soviet military performance across multiple fronts. Finnish military leadership recognized that they possessed something extraordinary in Simo Häyhä. His individual impact on the war effort exceeded that of entire battalions, and his psychological value was immeasurable. Special arrangements were made to ensure that he had access to the best equipment available, though Simo typically preferred to stick with the simple rifle and iron sights that had served him so well. Media coverage of Simo's exploits began appearing in newspapers around the world, though the Finnish government was careful to limit details that might compromise his operations. The story of a simple farmer who had become one of the most effective soldiers in military history captured international imagination and provided much-needed morale boosts for Finnish civilians who were watching their country fight for its life against impossible odds. As winter began to ease its grip and the conflict entered its final phase, Simo Häyhä had achieved something that seemed impossible at the war's beginning. A single individual, using nothing more than exceptional skill and intimate knowledge of his home terrain, had become a strategic factor in a conflict between nations. The quiet farmer from Rautjärvi had transformed into a legend that would outlive the war itself. But his greatest test was still ahead. The Soviet Union was preparing a massive final offensive designed to crush Finnish resistance once and for all. In response, Finnish commanders were gathering their most effective fighters for desperate last stands that would determine whether their nation survived as an independent country. For Simo, the transition from individual hunter to defender of his homeland was about to take a dramatic and nearly fatal turn. In 1917, every able-bodied man was required to serve in the military. Simo completed his mandatory service with the Finnish Civil Guard, where his shooting abilities caught the attention of his instructors. They tried to convince him to pursue advanced military training, but Simo had no interest in being a career soldier. He wanted nothing more than to return to his farm, to live quietly in the forests he loved. The Civil Guard training did teach him valuable skills beyond what he had learned hunting. He discovered how to camouflage himself not just from animals, but from human eyes trained to spot hidden threats. He learned about different types of rifles and ammunition, about calculating distances and adjusting for weather conditions. Most importantly, he learned about the mental discipline required for precision shooting under pressure. After completing his service, Simo returned to civilian life and seemed content to remain there forever. He worked the family farm, participated in local shooting competitions, and helped his neighbors when they needed an extra hand. The shooting competitions were where his abilities really shone. Using the same basic rifle he hunted with, Simo regularly outshot competitors who had expensive equipment and years of formal training. The other competitors respected him, but Many couldn't understand how this quiet farmer managed such incredible accuracy. Simo never boasted about his wins or tried to explain his techniques. When pressed, he would simply say that he tried to become one with his rifle, to feel where the bullet would go before he even pulled the trigger. To most people, this sounded like mystical nonsense, but those who knew Simo well understood that he had developed an almost supernatural connection with his weapon. The political situation in Europe grew more tense throughout the 1930s. Germany was rearming rapidly, and the Soviet Union was expanding its influence wherever possible. Finland found itself in an impossible position, caught between these two giants with nowhere to run. Most Finns hoped that their country's small size and relative poverty would make it an uninteresting target, but Stalin had other plans. The Soviet Union demanded that Finland cede large portions of its territory, particularly areas near Leningrad that Stalin considered strategically important. When the Finnish government refused these demands, Soviet forces began massing on the border. Despite desperate diplomatic efforts, war seemed inevitable. The entire nation began preparing for what everyone knew would be a hopeless fight against impossible odds. Simo received his mobilization orders on November 30th, 1939, the same day Soviet forces crossed the Finnish border. At 34 years old, he was older than most of the recruits being called up, and his small stature made him seem like an unlikely warrior. His commanding officers initially planned to assign him to support duties, figuring that someone of his size and age would be better suited for logistics than frontline combat. Everything changed when Simo's previous Civil Guard instructors vouched for his shooting abilities. They told stories of competitions where he had achieved perfect scores with equipment that other marksmen would consider inadequate. One instructor mentioned watching Simo hit targets at 500 meters with iron sights in conditions where younger men with scopes were struggling to see their targets at all. The battalion commander decided to give Simo a chance to prove himself at the rifle range. What happened next became part of military legend. In freezing temperatures, with snow falling and wind gusting across the range, Simo proceeded to place shot after shot in the exact center of targets at distances that challenged even the best marksman in the unit. When the range officer asked if he wanted to try the moving targets, Simo simply nodded and continued his methodical shooting. Every moving target fell with a single shot. Every stationary target showed a tight group of holes clustered in the center ring. The other soldiers watching began to whisper among themselves, wondering if they were witnessing something extraordinary or if the quiet farmer was just having a lucky day. The battalion commander had seen enough. Instead of assigning Simo to support duties, he immediately transferred him to the most dangerous posting available: forward reconnaissance and sniper operations. The unit Simo joined was tasked with slowing down Soviet advances through a combination of hit and run tactics and precision shooting. These men would be operating alone or in very small groups, deep in enemy territory, with little hope of rescue if things went wrong. It was exactly the kind of assignment that killed experienced soldiers quickly and inexperienced ones even faster. Simo's new commanding officer, Lieutenant Arne Jutalainen, was skeptical when he first met his newest team member. The lieutenant had been expecting a young, athletic soldier with formal sniper training. Instead, he got a short, middle-aged farmer who looked like he had wandered away from a harvest festival. Jutalainen's skepticism vanished completely during Simo's first mission. The assignment seemed simple enough: observe and report on Soviet troop movements along a forest road that the enemy was using to move supplies forward. If opportunities arose for disrupting these movements without revealing their position, they were authorized to take them. Simo and two other soldiers took up positions overlooking the road just before dawn, settling in for what they expected to be a long day of watching and waiting. The Soviet convoy appeared around midday, a long line of trucks carrying ammunition and supplies to forward positions. The convoy was protected by armed guards walking alongside the vehicles, and Simo could see officers riding in cars at the front and rear of the formation. It was exactly the kind of target that could significantly impact enemy operations, but it was also well defended and moving through open ground where return fire would be devastating. Simo studied the convoy through his rifle scope, noting the spacing between vehicles, the positions of the guards, and the terrain features that might provide cover for a quick escape. Without saying a word to his companions, he lined up his first shot and squeezed the trigger. An officer fell from his car instantly, causing the entire convoy to screech to a halt as soldiers scrambled for cover. Before anyone could determine where the shot had come from, Simo fired again. Another officer dropped. Then, a guard who had climbed onto a truck to get a better view of the forest. Each shot was placed with surgical precision, striking targets that other marksmen would consider nearly impossible at that range and under those conditions. The convoy's organized defensive formation collapsed into chaos as soldiers ran in every direction, unsure where the deadly, accurate fire was coming from. In less than 5 minutes, Simo had eliminated 8 enemy soldiers and sent an entire convoy into panicked retreat. His 2 companions watched in amazement as this quiet farmer systematically dismantled an enemy force many times their size without ever seeming hurried or stressed. When Soviet reinforcements arrived to investigate the ambush, they found nothing but empty forest and a road littered with abandoned supplies. Word of the ambush spread quickly through Finnish military circles. Intelligence reports indicated that the Soviets had diverted an entire company to search for the sniper unit responsible for the attack, completely disrupting their advance schedule for that sector. More importantly for Finnish morale, it proved that individual soldiers with superior skills could have an impact far beyond their numbers in this new kind of warfare. Lieutenant Judalainen's report on the mission was filled with superlatives that his superiors initially found hard to believe. A single marksman achieving 8 confirmed kills against a defended convoy seemed impossible, especially when that marksman was an untrained farmer using standard military equipment. Judalainen insisted that he had witnessed something extraordinary, and that Simo Hiha represented exactly the kind of asymmetric advantage Finland needed to have any hope of surviving the Soviet onslaught. The military leadership decided to give Simo more opportunities to prove his worth. Over the following weeks, he was sent on increasingly difficult missions, each one designed to test the limits of his abilities. He never failed to exceed expectations. Supply convoys learned to fear certain stretches of forest road where vehicles would be found abandoned, their drivers and guards nowhere to be seen. Soviet patrols began reporting encounters with a phantom marksman who could strike from impossible distances and vanish without a trace. The psychological impact on Soviet forces was almost as important as the tactical victories. Soldiers began refusing to take point positions, knowing that the lead man in any patrol was likely to become a target for the invisible sniper. Officers stopped riding in the open tops of vehicles, preferring to remain hidden even though it reduced their ability to command their units effectively. Entire companies would freeze when they heard a single rifle shot, unsure whether they were under attack by one man or an entire enemy unit. Simo's success was built on more than just exceptional shooting skills. His deep knowledge of forest terrain allowed him to move through enemy territory without being detected, setting up shooting positions that provided perfect fields of fire while remaining virtually invisible to return observation. His patience, developed through years of hunting, meant he could wait motionless for hours until the perfect target presented itself. Perhaps most importantly, Simo understood that his greatest weapon was not his rifle, but the fear and uncertainty he created in enemy minds. Every successful mission made Soviet forces more cautious, more likely to bunch up for protection, more reluctant to advance quickly through terrain where they might encounter the phantom sniper. This psychological warfare was multiplying the impact of his physical presence on the battlefield. As winter deepened and the war intensified, Simo Hiha was transforming from a simple farmer into something much more significant. The Soviet military was beginning to realize that they faced an opponent unlike anything in their experience. Someone who combined natural talent with deep knowledge of the terrain and an almost mystical ability to appear and disappear at will. The quiet man who had once worried only about crop yields and hunting seasons was about to become one of the most feared individuals in the entire war.